Maybe you've heard the statistic that global food systems are responsible for a tremendous portion of global greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs, a staggering 34% according to the Food and Agriculture Organization. The majority of those emissions come from the supply chain, or Scope 3. Perhaps even more surprising is that nearly 3/4 of those emissions are a result of on-farm practices before fossil fuel-thirsty transportation and distribution even come into the picture. Those on-farm emissions are most influenced by three factors: what an ingredient is, where it's grown, and how it's grown. But let's back up a little bit. GHGs are naturally occurring gases, namely carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, that trap heat in the atmosphere. This dangerous temperature increase is a result of human activities like the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, and carbon-intensive agricultural practices. Let's get a better understanding of Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are emissions that result from activities that are not directly owned or controlled by a company, but that are a part of a company's value chain. For a food company, Scope 3 emissions could come from a variety of sources, such as agricultural practices used to grow raw materials, transportation of products to market, and waste generated from packaging materials. It's important for companies to consider their Scope 3 emissions in order to fully understand and address their carbon footprint and work toward reducing their impact on the environment. Especially because, for many food products, as much as 70 to 90% of the product's impact is determined before it even leaves the farm gate. So what does farm to farm gate really mean? Farm to farm gate refers to the emissions caused by the act of growing a specific ingredient before any factory, processing, transportation, or distribution emissions. One of the biggest contributors to high farm to farm gate impact is land use change. When ecosystems are cleared or burned to make way for agriculture, a tremendous amount of stored carbon is released into the atmosphere, mostly in the form of carbon dioxide, an estimated 4.8 billion tons each year between 2015 and 2017. What are the factors that most influence the GHG impact of a food product? The first is crop and ingredient type. Some ingredients are inherently more carbon intensive than others. Rice paddies, for example, emit a large amount of methane regardless of how or where they're grown. Another common example is industrial ruminant-based meat production, which usually has a very high GHG impact due to the combination of methane, which is naturally released by grazing animals, in addition to the likelihood that habitats were cleared in order to make room for pasture. Nearly equal to enteric fermentation emissions, which is the digestive process that produces methane, are emissions related to feed production. Livestock feed contributes 41% of animal agriculture's total emissions. The second factor is source location. Certain locations are associated with higher energy and fossil fuel usage for crop production than others. Using tomatoes as an example, if the source location is in a cooler climate, the tomatoes are likely grown in a greenhouse, which is associated with higher GHG impact. On the other hand, tomatoes grown outside in warmer climates have a lower carbon footprint. And lastly, let's consider growing practices. For an animal-based ingredient like beef, selecting standards and certifications such as Land to Market can reduce GHGs due to its minimal use of fossil fuels, tillage, and synthetic fertilizers. Cattle raised conventionally in the United States can emit up to 35 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef produced, whereas according to some research, Land to Market verified meat has a CO2 equivalent per kilogram that is negative. In summary, meeting ESG commitments for food companies means evaluating the greenhouse gas emissions of their entire supply chain with a focus on on-farm emissions. In order to successfully execute on these goals, companies will need access to crop and location-specific data as well as the growing practices used for each ingredient. Overall, understanding the environmental impact of different ingredients and making choices that take these factors into account can help to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the food industry at large and make a significant difference in mitigating climate change.